In this lecture, we are going to learn about setValue and patchValue method in a reactive form. Using setValue and patchValue method on a reactive form is very similar to how we use it on a template-driven form. The setValue method is used to update a form control, form group, or form array value. Now, when we use setValue method, we need to pass an object to the setValue method, and the structure of that object must match the value property of the form control, form group, or form array which we are trying to update. Let's understand this with an example. In this form, we have this create username button. Now what we want is, when a user clicks on this create username button, it should automatically generate a username for that user based on his first name, last name, and date of birth. And then that username should be automatically populated in this username form control. So for that, we can make use of setValue method. Now, when do we want to update this username form control? When this create a username button is clicked. So on this create a username button, let's first go ahead and let's bind click event. So let's go to appcomponent.html and let's scroll down to that username input, and here we have this button, and on this button we are going to bind click event, and to this click event let's assign a method. Let's call it maybe generate username. And now let's go ahead and let's create this method inside this app component class. Now in order to save some time, I have already created this method, this generate username method. So I'll copy this logic from here and let's paste it here. So basically what we are doing here is, inside this generate username button, we are getting the value from this first name, last name, and date of birth form control. And we are storing it in these variables fname, lname, and dob. Then we are checking if the first name length is greater than or equal to 3, then we are going to take the first 3 characters from the first name. But if it is less than 3, then we are going to take the full value of the first name. In the same way, if the length of last name is greater than or equal to 3, in that case, we are going to take first 3 characters from the last name. Otherwise, we are going to take the complete last name and we are going to append it to this username variable. In the same way, we are also reading the value of date of birth and we are converting it to date value. And from that date, we are getting the full year, the birth year from that date of birth. And then we are appending it to this username. Finally, here we are converting the username all to lowercase, and then we are logging the username here. So if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, let's enter a first name, let's say John. Let's enter a last name, let's say Smith, and let's select a date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you will notice that a username has been generated based on the first name, last name, and date of birth. Okay, but if I don't enter any value in this first name field and in this last name field, and if I click on this create a username button, you will see that the username is 2023. So basically it is only displaying the year from the date of birth because first name and last name is empty. Okay, if I refresh the page and I simply click on this create a username button, so we have not entered any value in the first name, last name, and date of birth field. If I click on this create a username button, you see we have an error because in the code we are trying to read the length of first name and last name control, but since we have not provided any value here, the value in these form controls will be null because that's what we are passing as a default value for these form controls, and on that null we are trying to read the length value. So what we need to do is, if there is no value in the first name, last name, and date of birth, then we will disable this create a username button. Only when the first name, last name, and date of birth values are supplied, then only this create a username button should be enabled. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go back to VS Code and let's go to appcomponent.html, and we want to disable this button if the first name, last name, and date of birth does not contain a value. So here we are going to use the disable attribute, and on this we are going to do property binding. So what is the condition we are going to check? We are going to check if the first name form control, last name form control, and date of birth form control contains a value, then only we want to enable this button. Otherwise, this button should be disabled. So to get the value of first name form control on this reactive form property, we can use get method, and to this we need to pass the name of the form control, which is first name dot value. So if it contains a value, in that case this expression will return true. Otherwise, if it does not contain a value, in that case it will be either empty string or it will be null, right? So in that case this will return false. So let me wrap it within parenthesis like this. Okay, so if the first name contains a value, in that case this expression will return true. In that case, we don't want to disable the button. In that case, we want to enable the button. So here I'll use the not operator. Now, not only first name, we also want to check for last name and date of birth. So here we'll also use or operator. Actually, we need to use and operator, because if all the three fields have some value, then only we want to enable the button. So for the property name, let's pass last name, and again let's use and operator. And here for the property name, let's pass date of birth. Now we can move these end statements in a separate line in order to make it more readable. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's see if this button is enabled or not. So when I click on this create a username button, so button is still not disabled. Let's see why is that. All right, we need to move this parenthesis here. Now let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now when I click on this create a username button, we don't see any error. But if I enter a first name, a last name, and a date of birth, now this button should be enabled. And when I click on this create a username button, it is showing that username based on first name, last name, and date of birth. So this requirement is also done. Now finally, instead of logging the generated username in the console, we want to populate this username form control with that automatically generated username. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go back to VS Code again, and let's go to app component.ts. And in this method, inside this generate username method, after we have calculated the username, instead of logging it in the console, what we want to do is we want to populate the username form control. For that, what we can do is on the reactive form. So for that, we can access this reactive form property, and on that we can call setValue method. And to this setValue method, we need to pass an object. And as we learned earlier, this object structure must match the object structure of the form control, form group, or form array on which we are using it. Currently, we are using it on this reactive form group. So the object which we are passing here, its structure must match the structure of that form group. So basically, it must match this structure. So here we have an object. So the structure of the object which we are passing to the setValue method, it must match the structure of this object. That object must have these properties. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll copy all these properties from here, and let me go ahead and let me paste it inside this object which we are passing to this setValue. And instead of assigning it a form control, we are going to set its value to empty string. Let's do the same thing for other form controls. And here to this address, we need to assign an object. Okay, and in that object, let's set the value for street, country, city, region, and postal code. And let's remove this closing parenthesis. In the same way, for this skills, let's assign it with an array, because this skills is a form array. So for the form group, for this address property, which is a form group, we assign an object. For the skills, which is a form array, we are going to assign an array. And in that array, let's say we are going to have only one skill, and I'm going to set the value for that skill to empty string. In the same way, for this experience, we are going to assign an array, and this array, it is going to be an empty array. And let's include this closing curly brace and also this parenthesis. All right. So this is the same structure which we have specified for this reactive form group. Now here we want to set the username, and we want to set this username with this username value. So let's go ahead and let's assign it here. With this, let's save the changes and let's see if it works or not. So let's go back to our web application. In the form, let's enter first name, let's say John, last name Smith, and let's select a date of birth. Okay, let me clear the console here. And when I click on this create a username button, you will notice that this username form control has been populated with the generated username. Okay, but other fields have become empty. That's because when we are going to click on this create a username button, inside that we are calling this setValue method. So this setValue method is going to set the value for each of the form controls as empty string. As you can see, it will only update the username with the generated username value, but all other form controls we are setting it to empty string. But we don't want to do that, right? So here, instead of setting it to empty string, what we are going to do is we are going to access each of the form controls. We are going to read its value and we are going to assign it to these properties. So for example, to this first name, we want to assign the value which the user has entered inside the first name form control. For that, again, we need to access the reactive form property. On that, we are going to use the get method. There, we are going to specify the property name, which is first name. So this first name is basically this form control name. Okay, so we are accessing that first name form control using its property name. So this is going to return us the first name form control. On that, we are going to access its value property. Let's go ahead and let's do the same thing for other properties as well. Now, we are not going to change the username because this username we want to update with this username value. So we are not going to read the value of username form control and set that value to this username. Okay, so this is the one field which you wanted to update, but for the other fields, the value should be same which the user has entered in those form controls. Now for the address, inside this address, we have this street property. So here, instead of saying simply street, we don't have any property called street in this form group. So in this reactive form, we don't have any property called street. Instead, we have this address property, and inside that address property, we have the street property. So in order to access this street property, what we need to do is we need to say address dot street. Okay, and then we need to access its value. Let's do the same thing for country, city, region, and postal code. Then for the skills, again, we are going to read the skills property. So here we will say skills, and that form control, it is going to store an array, and we want to assign that array to this skills property. And experience also, we are going to do the same thing. So here we'll pass the property name as experience. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now if I specify the first name, last name, and if I select the date of birth, and now when I click on this create a username button, it is calculating the username, but it is not making these fields empty. So now we don't have any error, any validation error. So it is working as expected. Now let's see one more thing. So we have learned that we can use this set value method on a form group, form array, or form control. So now instead of accessing this set value method on this form group, let's try to simply access it on the form control, on the username form control. So let me comment this expression here and let's get access to the username form control. For that, let's first access this reactive form. On that, let's use this get method. Let's pass the control name, which is username, and on this, let's try to use set value method. And as we learned, to the set value method, we need to pass the structure of the form group, form array, or form control on which we are using it. So for the username, the structure is simple. It is just a primitive value. So instead of passing an object, here we will simply pass the value which we want to update. So for example, when we used it on the reactive form, This reactive form, it is a form group, and to that form group we pass an object. But this username, it is simply a form control, and the value property of this form control, it is not going to contain any object or an array. It is simply going to contain a value. So that's why instead of passing an object here, we are going to pass the value which we want to set for this username form control, and that value we have inside the username variable. Let's see if it works or not. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's enter first name, last name, and let's also enter the date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you see it is still populating that username form control. So you can also call this setValue method on a form control itself instead of calling it on a form group. Now you can use this setValue method on a form group when you want to update multiple fields. But if you want to update only a single field, then calling this setValue method on the form control itself should be okay. Alright, so this was about setValue method. Here we learned how to use a setValue method on a form group and also on a form control. But we can also use a setValue method on a form array. Now, let's see how we can update a form group using patchValue method. So the patchValue method is also used to update a subset of the element of form group or form array. And keep in mind that it is only going to update the matching objects and ignore the rest. So let's see how we can use patchValue method. So again, on the reactive form group, we are going to call patchValue method. Now, if you remember when we were using this patchValue method on a template driven form, there on the form object, we were also calling form property, and on that form property, we were accessing this patchValue method. But here we can access this patchValue method directly on the form group. And to this, we need to pass an object, and inside this object, we need to specify the structure of the property which we want to update. We want to update the username property here, right? So we simply need to pass username, and there we need to specify what value do we want to update for that username. So here to this username property, we want to assign the value stored in the username variable. So the value which we have calculated here. Okay, and that should be it. If I save the changes, if we go back to the web page, let's enter first name, last name, and the date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you see it is calculating the username, and it is also not setting other values to empty string. So it is working as expected. So if you want to update a form group, in that case, using this patch value is better approach, because here you don't need to specify the complete structure of the form group, right? But when we were using this set value method on the form group, in that case, to that form group, we needed to pass the complete structure of that form group, even if we were updating only one field. So this is the advantage of using patch value over set value. Now, if you want to update, let's say in this form group, if you want to update, let's say this city field, then you will have to specify the complete structure of the city field. For example, this city property is present inside this address property, right? So the object which we are passing to this patch value method, let's say we also want to update the city property. So the structure of that city property will be, first we need to specify the address property, because that city property is present inside address property. This address property, it is an object, and in that object we have the city property. And to this city property now we can specify a value which we want to update. For example, let's say we want to update it to Delhi, or maybe New Delhi. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's enter first name and last name. Let's also select a date of birth. All right. And now when I click on this create a username button, it is going to generate a username, and it is going to populate this username form control with that username. And it is also going to update this city form control with New Delhi. So when I click on this create a username button, you see this form control is updated with the value New Delhi, and the username is also generated and populated in the username form control. So this is how we can use patch value method. So we use setValue and patchValue method to update a form control in a form. And setValue and patchValue method can be used on a form control, on a form group, or a form array. Here we are using this patchValue method on a form group, but we can also use it on a form array and a form control. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.